This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is victim culture and responsibility. I have Ben Hourigan, who is a writer who's written about this, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Ben Hourigan is a writer. He's originally from Australia, and I wanted to do a show on the nature of victim culture, specifically in the West. I've tried to get a number of people, but he was the only person that I could find who had written about the subject that was willing to speak on camera. So I want to give him a few minutes to give a little background about himself, and then talk about his particular article and views, therefore. So Ben, welcome, and a little bit of background about who you are.
Sure. So right at this minute, I am a freelance editor and copywriter. Um, I write advertorials for some big companies. I won't mention who I do that through. I also do a lot of editing of books for self-publishing authors and editing stuff for business, marketing materials and so on. And I live in Bangkok. Although I'm from Australia, I left several years ago to kind of be a digital nomad, I guess was my ambition, and I landed here. So that might still leave you wondering why I would be interested in victim culture. And yeah, go ahead. Were you about to say something, Dan?
Well, Australia is considered part of the West, even though it's quote unquote in the East. Is there a
Yeah.
difference that you've noticed, for example, culturally between Southern Asia or Southeastern Asia, where you are now, and Australia? Is there an East-West difference?
There are a lot of differences. If we talk about victim culture specifically, there is a difference there. We could perhaps
Go ahead.
visit that.
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to talk about that now?
Yeah, why not? Go ahead.
So, I mean, I guess, well, let's talk a bit about what victim culture is first, and then perhaps we can get onto that.
Go ahead.
So, when Dan, when you were inviting me to do this, victim culture was the word that you used. I felt that I knew what you were talking about, although I don't know whether this is something that's necessarily recognized in, say, academic discourse. I think what we would think about is maybe a sense that people are more interested than they have been in the past in claiming the identity of a victim, and in deploying that in their conversations with others. Perhaps to blame others for not treating them correctly, or to claim some special sort of consideration. I guess I would also think, and this is part of my background that I didn't talk about. A long time ago, I was a PhD student in cultural studies. I was doing some research into the political ideology in Japanese role-playing video games, so games like Final Fantasy and stuff like that. And in the cultural studies discipline, this was in the mid 2000s. I think I stopped about 2005. There was a lot of interest in the issues related to people or practices that had been, quote, marginalized, right? So the thing that everybody was interested in cultural studies were mainly marginalized racial or gendered identities and practices. So we had a lot of people in the department who are interested in queer theory, queer identity in cinema. They're interested in post-colonial theory. What else? Mainly queer and post-colonial stuff because of the makeup of the department. I guess in an American department or faculty of the same nature, you would probably have an increased interest in race, although certain kind of American theories of race in relation to culture were certainly of great interest in cultural studies back when I was a researcher, right? So I would, if I may, I would relate that to an extent to victim culture as well, in that there is this, particularly in the academy, a very, very strong interest in anything associated with the identities or practices of people who are deemed to be victims, and correspondingly, in an analysis, often a condemnation of the identities and practices of people who belong to, let's call them oppressor groups. So, sorry, you were about to say something, Dan.
Well, I know that here in America, I've often said that political correctness wants diversity in things people can't control, like the color or shape of their eyes, the color of their skin, sexual partner, sexuality, this, that, or the other thing, which most people would say people can't control. But they don't really want diversity in the thing most people and everyone can control, which is a diversity of ideas. Do you find that... I mean, I just did a show a couple of days ago talking about binary thinking, and we think left, right, black, white, 0, 1, rather than the multiplicity of things between black and white. What is your take on that?
On diversity of thought, I mean, funnily enough, I don't think that in this period that I'm talking about, so up to around 2005, I didn't hear the word diversity mentioned in the university, right? And I hadn't really been in the workplace. I think I was about, 23 at that point when I left the university. I hadn't heard the word diversity at that point. But I can still say that there certainly was not a great deal of diversity of viewpoint within that department. I mean, you don't want to overgeneralize about what people believe. You would definitely say that you were expected to be left in that department, and there's an institutional reason for that. Well, there's a reason related to the discipline, which is that cultural studies is a discipline that is explicitly founded on Marxist cultural theory, right? So if you were not to identify as left-wing, you would kind of be setting yourself at odds with the intellectual foundations of that discipline. And that's not a particularly diverse setup when you think about it.
Well, let me just sort of speak more generally, broadly about Australia. And this is for me to find out. Australia seems to be a lot more lily white than even the U.S. or a lot of Europe is. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is. Is it like 1 or 2% Aboriginal?
I believe it's around 2%, but I certainly wouldn't say that Australia is like a kind of monocultural or monoethnic country.
Well, you are from Western Australia, correct me, right? You're from Perth?
I'm from Victoria, actually, which is in the southeast. We have the country's second largest city, Melbourne, which is where I'm from.
The reason I ask is because here in the U.S. we talk about blue and red states for the last 20 years, almost since Gore and Bush's election. Is the west of Australia Perth? Because I did do an interview with someone from Perth, I believe, once. And is Perth more Wild West? Is that more rugged, individual, conservative, and the East is more liberal? Or what is sort of? Let me just ask the political makeup.
That's right. So I mean, just a few very minor points of detail, right? We have a party called the Liberal Party in Australia, and the Liberal Party is the right-wing party, right? So as you're aware, liberal means different things in British and American English. So what we call the Liberal Party is the party of business. It's the analog to the Republicans or the Tories. We also have the Labor Party, which is the analog to the Democrats, as you would expect a Labor Party to be. Okay, so where I grew up is probably the bluest of blue states, right? And Western Australia, which you just mentioned, is probably one of the states that you would think of as being a red state from an American point of view. And the other one that's a red state is Queensland, which is in the northeast.
So you talked about the academia and queer theory and whatnot, and I mentioned Aboriginals. Is there a movement amongst the Aboriginals of Australia to get, like in Canada, they Native American, what we call American Indians or Native Americans, are called First Nations there, and they have even more autonomy than Native Americans here in America. Do Aboriginals have autonomy in certain like areas of Australia? Are they agitating for separation or something like that?
I couldn't speak to that in great detail.
Okay.
But let me just say something, that there have been some controversies relating to Aboriginal communities. They're usually in what we would consider remote areas, so they're along some way from big cities, right? And whether or not they have autonomy in governing their affairs, there may have been a sense where the law was not applied to them rigorously. Mm-hmm. And then there were some scandals associated with that, where cases of, say, child abuse might have been discovered, and there have been pushes from the federal government to apply the law more rigorously, and then there's pushback against that. In the sense that Indigenous communities or people who advocate for those communities may not want to see more government involvement there. So,
well,
go on. Well, I was just going to say that regardless of the position that you took on this, I think it would be fair to say that the cause of Indigenous people is less advanced in Australia than it is in some countries in a similar situation. I think that there's been more advancement of that conversation in Canada, in the United States, in New Zealand, which is very near to us. Although in New Zealand there's a special case because the Maori, who were the kind of colonized people, if you like, they actually had a formal treaty with the colonial power, which our Indigenous people never did.
Well, let me ask. Let me get specifically to some of the things within the article that you had written, and it's on your website, benhourigan.com. We have in the U.S. what's been called the hashtag Me Too movement recently in the last year or so, with a lot of big name or media, semi-celebrity females who are talking about sexual harassment in Hollywood, in the workplace, and in politics. And you, one of the first parts of the essay that you had written about this deals with moral and causal responsibility in regards to rape.
Sure.
So let me just ask you if you could just define the difference between moral and causal responsibility and how you think it relates to rape or any other kind of male-female power structure.
Sure. So, just to introduce something, this was a response to a conversation about victim blaming, which is another aspect that you might look at of victim culture. So if people have heard of Slut Walk, for example, it's like a feminist kind of event. I believe it started in Toronto, and it was in response to police making some remark about women who had been raped, that they shouldn't have done this or that. They shouldn't have dressed in a particular way, or they shouldn't have been in a particular place. And a range of people might have a backlash against that kind of claim, saying that it's victim blaming, right? And this would mean that you are saying to somebody who has had something bad happen to them that it was their fault. And in certain cases, say, for instance, if a woman has been raped and you say, it's your fault that you've been raped, that would be seen as objectionable by some people, and arguably rightly so.
Or if someone was dressed very hugging clothes, and their nipples were protruding, and they were a little tipsy, and they were flirting with every man in the room, that would somehow be an invitation to sex.
Yeah, but that if you were to bring that up, then you would be accused of victim blaming. But pretty much, you could find somebody who would accuse you of victim blaming, and maybe rightly so. Okay, so moral and causal responsibility. Let's take that example. I will use the example that I prefer is where somebody has been walking in a dangerous area, for example. So this actually came up in my home city recently. I won't name the person involved, but there was a woman who was raped and murdered. She was walking through an area which I am familiar with personally as not being a particularly safe feeling place that I would want to walk through. Nevertheless, when the police suggested that women in the area look out for their personal safety, they were accused of blaming the victim. Yeah. So if you go to a dangerous place and something bad happens to you, right, I would say that there's an argument that you have contributed in some way to what happened to you happening. This is what I would say is the causal responsibility. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't put yourself in the dangerous position, this thing could not have happened.
Yeah.
So the other side of that, though, is the moral responsibility. So is it really blameworthy, for example, that you went to this dangerous place? You know, you can't say that you did something morally wrong.
Yeah. By
walking in a dangerous place, right? And the immoral thing that was done to you, the fact that you were coerced or that you were harmed, for instance, is a bad act, right? And the person who is morally responsible for that is the perpetrator of that act.
Well, just to define,
so that's the basic difference. Yeah.
Just to define it, just so people can see it more clearly. Let me give you two examples. It's 1888 in Whitechapel, London, and there's a lunatic that we know is going around killing women and ripping out their innards. And a man says to his girlfriend, I don't think you should walk to Whitechapel to get to the church to pray in the morning with this lunatic running around. The woman says no, but she's going to do it, and she ends up dead. Another example would be, though, let's say that I am alone at home and I want to go to the deli to get something to eat, and I leave a box of matches out, and I'm babysitting a kid. So I leave the kid for 20 minutes. The kid plays with matches and burns down my house. Now, the difference is the adult woman is capable of making the choice to endanger herself or not. The child would not necessarily have that same responsibility, correct?
Okay, sure. Well, the child would not.
Right.
But we might say that you had a responsibility not to leave the matches out there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is interesting. I mean, you know, there's a basic concept in Western philosophy, right? That to be morally responsible for something, and I believe this comes from Aristotle, if not earlier. To be morally responsible for something, you have to have known what you were doing, right? You have to have been capable of understanding the situation, and you have to have been capable of doing something different. So the child doesn't satisfy that criteria because they don't know what they were doing. You know, equally, if you, if you were forced to commit a crime, for example, you know, at gunpoint, you're forced at gunpoint to withdraw money from your grandmother's ATM card or something like that. You're probably not going to be considered morally responsible for that because you can't reasonably be expected to have done anything else. You weren't in full control of your own actions.
Well, just to give another example too, I wrote a play once about when I was a teenager, 13 years old, and me and this young girl who was the same age or about half a year younger went up to a balcony and started diddling each other during the 1 year anniversary of the Star Wars release. I was 13, she was maybe 12 and a half. Now, you could say statutory, well, they're both children, neither of them are responsible. But as a 53-year-old man now, 40 years later, if I tried to diddle some 12-year-old girl, that's a whole different story, even though it's still two human beings having sex and one of them is 12. So it's not only this. I would have a moral responsibility due to my 4 decades that I wouldn't have had 4 decades ago when I'm 13.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's interesting, even just you mentioning that example, I can understand why certain people wouldn't have wanted to come on the video and talk about this topic. I'm not saying just because of that example, but these things, they often are kind of emotive, and we have an expectation now that people are going to be watching what we do and say, what we say, particularly for a misstep that they can object to and use against us, which I think is part of the victim culture thing as well, part of the phenomenon.
Well, that brings up the idea of what is actually propelling this idea of victim culture. Is it a sense of justice, or is it a sense of moral one-upsmanship so that I can claim the higher ground to you?
Yeah. Yeah, wow. So, I mean, I think there are a range of motivations. Something that I think is important to bring up here is that not too long ago, although it might now be 2015 or something like that, this happened. There was a paper that came out, a sociology paper. I believe the authors, their names were Campbell and Manning or something like that. And Jonathan Haidt, who many people may have heard of, is the author of The Righteous Mind. And he studies, I guess, what does he say? He studies moral psychology, I think is what he says. So he studies, how it works, how people think things are right and wrong, and, what motivates differences in political ideologies and stuff like that. So he brought this paper to people's attention. Now, this sociology paper talked about a thing that they called victimhood culture. And it's an overall social shift that seems to be happening to do with the way that we view insults. So this paper talks about the move between three different cultures: honor culture, dignity culture, and victimhood culture. Now, honor culture is the culture where maybe somebody insults your mother and you challenge them to a duel and somebody ends up dead, right? Not victimhood culture, dignity culture is the culture that you and I would probably be familiar with being taught by maybe our parents. The motto, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? So there's a kind of stoicism. We can handle our personal response to a situation that we feel is insulting or offensive. We're not going to go and tell teacher because somebody said something nasty about us. But if somebody injures us, like deliberately, somebody assaults us or tries to kill us or steals our stuff, then we'll happily go to the police rather than deciding to duel or to take justice into our own hands. So the next evolution, victimhood culture, is where we are acutely sensitive to slights, and we will very quickly try to appeal to some authority, be it the authority of the mob or the authority of some institution, let's say a university administrator or some kind of anti-discrimination tribunal, for example, that we will appeal to these bodies or to the mob to get justice on our behalf because of some small slight that we suffered, maybe a, quote, microaggression. Mm-hmm. So that was, okay, so what is causing it? Yeah. So these sociologists, being sociologists, they were saying that, the reason that this has happened is because there's been a shift in our culture, right? So, and the shift that they talk about is atomization is one. So I guess like a loosening of social bonds or community, like people are kind of immersed in this, free-floating sea of individuals in the internet, but we may not have close personal bonds with people or with a group of people. We may not know who our neighbors are or, who everybody in our class even is at school. So there's atomization. There is also, and I think this is the most crucial, this is fascinating, right? you have probably heard, I have certainly heard, whether it's from, academics or serious cultural commentators or just kind of tabloid journalists and people on Facebook, you hear this idea that things are getting worse,
Yeah.
right? That, let's say America is becoming more racist, or America is becoming more sexist, or, you can hear this in Australia too. Australia is getting more sexist. Whatever Western multicultural country you are in, you can hear people saying this. Now, the thing is that this is not true, right? The West is becoming less racist and less sexist, and it has done over time. And the fact that that is true, according to these sociologists, is precisely one of the reasons that this victimhood culture has been able to occur.
Yeah.
And the reason, you're about to ask something?
No, go ahead. Finish. I'll ask. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's right. So the reason that this is important is because when people are relatively equal already, the slight becomes more obvious, I guess, right? So if we live in an anti-racist society, a society that is very explicitly anti-racist or anti-sexist, and where there is relatively little discrimination that goes on, particularly on an institutional basis, say through the law or through overt hiring policies or something like that, where things are relatively equal, these things stick out. And because our values are egalitarian, we see these things as particularly objectionable. If you like, our anti-racist values have caused us to become acutely sensitive to racist slights. Our anti-sexist values have caused us to be acutely sensitive to sexist slights.
Yeah. Let me just, and I don't know how familiar you are with U.S. culture. I would assume that you're still fairly well up on it, even over in Bangkok, because I'm sure there's probably a lot of American tourists that go over there that you interact with. Here in America, especially the last 2 or 3 years, there have been numerous videos posted of black people, especially black men, being harassed by police officers. The Black Lives Matter movement here in the U.S., and this is a real problem that has not changed. I mean, it's not as bad as it was 40 years ago, but it seems worse because now people have cell phones and can film it. And yet it seems that these instances of real victimization are often clouded by two other extremes. You have people like a fellow named Jordan Peterson, a college professor from Canada, who is sort of a soft right-wing apologist sort. And then you have people like, for example, capital F feminists here, both in the U.S. and in Europe, that will rail against male culture and rape culture here in the U.S., but when confronted with, for example, Islamic culture, which is far more sexist and far more abusive of women than Western culture now and today, they don't say a word because that would be cultural imperialism. So you have these political movements, both the sort of soft right of a Jordan Peterson and feminism, that you get things like black men being killed and abused by cops as a real problem, sort of gets washed away like that. People just sort of zone out. What is your take on that? And has there been any similar sort of thing that you've noticed in Europe or in Australia?
Well, I mean, just on the, say, black men being harassed by the police, for example, those things are obviously very serious. And, I think that people talking about this stuff, I guess as you did, that we're compelled to say that, gosh, those things are terrible and they ought not to happen. Although it is, I think, still worth recognizing that, as you say, these things are less common than they used to be. Perhaps still far too common, but that they are less common than they used to be. And that's progress that we should welcome.
Well, Steven Pinker wrote a whole book about that, and he's actually true. Here in America, for example, when I was a child in the 1970s, that was the worst time crime-wise in American history. Now it's a lot better, and wars. I mean, the amount of people killed in wars worldwide has been basically slipping decade by decade since World War II.
Yeah.
There are less people dying of famine, less people dying of and so we get this sort of focus on what would have been thought of as less or more minor offenses, which still are negatives that should be erased. Having a woman being, having her butt pinched is not throwing dead people into ovens, but
Yeah.
it's something that should be changed. But we're now focused on these smaller things because a lot of these bigger things have come down, especially in the West.
Yeah. I mean, just to, I hope this isn't a segue to come back to that thing that you just talked about before. But, so you mentioned, say, feminists not bringing up the rights of women in Islamic countries, for example.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've had some possibly ill-advised conversations with people, just acquaintances, let's say, about this issue. And if you raise it, they will say, well, the fact that women's rights are trampled on in some other country is not a reason to ignore the issues that we have in our own country. For example, they might raise the gender wage gap, or they might raise sexual harassment in the workplace.
Yeah.
I think another part of this is that, so if you mentioned the word cultural imperialism,
yeah,
and so that implies a certain relationship between, let's say, the Western country, where somebody is sitting and saying, but what about the rights of women in the Islamic world? It implies a relationship between that country and that person and people off somewhere in an Islamic country where presumably we are supposed to imagine that they have been subject to some kind of Western imperialist activity. And what is happening there is that the Islamic, let's say the people who are perpetrators of injustice against women in these Islamic countries are marked as being members of an oppressed group, and they are then being put outside of criticism.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You were about to say something.
No, don't get carried away with every little gesture that I move. But let me give you an example. Let me give you two examples. There's a great French film, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called The Wages of Fear, that deals with ugly American imperialism. And this would be the equivalent of, for example, there's honor culture in Brazil where a man, if he finds his wife has cheated on him or even thinks so, has a right to kill her. And this is like saying, well, because American corporate capitalists have exploited Brazilian farmers or whatnot, this gives that farmer now, 50 years later, a right or a free pass to murder his wife. Or similarly, because the U.S. supported the Shah of Iran, which led to the Iranian Revolution, this makes it morally right for Iranian mullahs to throw these dancing Iranian women now that are dancing on YouTube. Do you know about this revolution? That Iranian women are dancing on YouTube. Yeah, and they're thrown into jail now. Yeah, Iranian women have been jailed now for dancing on YouTube.
I mean, I'm vaguely aware of what goes on in Iran. There's two interesting things about what you said there. So one is that you mentioned honor, right? Yeah. So this harks back to that honor culture that these sociologists were talking about. Is the kind of the honor culture, the dignity culture, and the victimhood culture. So you're actually looking at a kind of older form of response to slights that comes from a markedly different social context. The other thing, which I think you will probably be interested in, is that in that paper that I wrote, where I was talking about the difference between moral and causal responsibility, I did kind of begin to talk about how this might affect our discussing American foreign policy, for example, and its effects on South American countries or the Middle East or whatever. So let's say that there is some sense in which American foreign policy, for example, has contributed to the disenfranchisement of this, what was it, a farmer or something who has killed his wife because she, I don't know, spoke to
another man,
someone in private. Or, right. And that, this impoverishment or, his ignorance is partly due to the economic circumstances, and that were circumstances different, he may not have been so angry, or he may have been better educated or something. So it's not, I mean, I don't really go in for that kind of victim of circumstance story, right? But if that were the case, you could say that, okay, there is some American causal responsibility for that, and that if our foreign policy were better, social conditions in this country might have been different, and this crime may not have occurred. But that doesn't change the fact that people far away enacting some foreign policy are probably not morally responsible for the fact that this woman was killed. The person who is morally responsible for that is the person who chose to do it, who ought to have known that it was wrong. There's a kind of transcendent moral wrongness to that has been recognized at many times in history and in many cultures, that this, you could find a priest in this country, for example, who would tell you without any ambiguity that regardless of the social context, it is wrong to kill your wife for speaking to another man, and that, you are unambiguously morally responsible for that, and that you will reap whatever punishment God has in store for you. Again, not saying that I subscribe to a religious morality, but certainly people who held religious ideas about morality would say that this killing was wrong, right?
And you also spoke of Islamic extremism. And here in the U.S. after 9/11, we heard a lot of people talking about, especially minority groups here in the U.S., talking about the chickens come home to roost, the whole thing they said about Kennedy after he was assassinated, that, the U.S. has exploited, along with Britain and the other colonial powers, exploited the people of the Middle East and, supported Israel. And this somehow relieves a lot of these extremists of their responsibility for mass murder, again, rape of women or whatnot within their own cultures, terrorist plots, etc. Now, clearly, that's not so. I mean, you can certainly have both things. That there's a causal responsibility of, say, past U.S. or current U.S. or past Western dealings with the Middle East, but that doesn't relieve the responsibility of, say, the ISIS member who goes in and slaughters a town, just like in Vietnam when we had the My Lai massacre. Just because we were in the fever of war, that did not relieve that officer Calley of his responsibility for massacring a hamlet.
Quite right. I mean, one of the things that I read over my essay again, just to familiarize myself with it before we started this. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading that bit was, if you take 9/11, just that specific event for an example, I would think that many people, somebody might make excuses for Islamic extremist organizations on the basis of that causal factor, right? The
Western imperial policy.
The Western imperialism, right? And try to absolve the terrorists of their moral responsibility to an extent, or to say that the West had it coming. and yet that same person, these two things clustered together, that exact same person would be, I would expect, one of the people who would most vociferously object if you were to suggest that a victim of rape had contributed in some causal way to what happened to them.
Yeah.
Well,
it's the equivalent. It's the equivalent. I argue with. Have always been involved in the arts community, and I was living in Minnesota at the time, a state in the upper Midwest of the U.S. And some of the people there on the far left in the artistic community again had their chickens come home to roost. And I said, how in the hell are you going to say to me that the Starbucks waitress who was killed in one of those buildings had anything to do with U.S. foreign policy over the prior 50 years? That person was pretty much an innocent. And even if you wanted to say that there were a few capitalist dogs that deserved to die, or maybe the random village rapist who got away with a string of rapes 15 years before that happened. Okay, that person may have had some karmic coming to. But the vast majority of those 3,000 people were just your average working people struggling to get in life. Yes, they were doing a little bit better than your average sheep herder in Iran, probably. But these were not people who were living off the fruits of American imperialism, really.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think that touches on something common to both situations, which is that, nobody has it coming to them in a moral sense when some criminal, or let's say terrorist or whatever, takes their life, for example. Nobody could deserve that in a moral sense. That could not be considered justice. Although, I mean, just a personal anecdote. I must say, to my great shame, that when 9/11 happened, I think if I'm correct in saying, that I was a postgraduate student at that point in cultural studies, and I think there was a sense of glee about what happened. I mean, it's much easier to take part in that in Australia, as I imagine they may have taken part in that in France or in the UK. But in these departments, which have a very strong left-wing cultural bias, I think there is a sense of enjoyment when the United States is seen to get its comeuppance. And once again, may I say, it is to my great shame that I partook in that.
And I'll give you another example. Here in the U.S., I'm sure you're probably familiar with the quote-unquote O.J. Simpson case, an American football player who supposedly killed his wife and another person. And here there was great joy in the black community when he got off, because it wasn't that they were necessarily celebrating that two white people were dead, but the fact that a black guy who was rich and famous could buy his way to freedom the way so many white people had over the years and centuries before that. And that doesn't make what they did right, but you can understand it. But you still have to take a sense of ethical responsibility about that too. So that's a much lesser thing than 9/11, but it's still that same kind of, Schadenfreude, inverted almost.
Yeah. I think Schadenfreude is a very bad impulse. Yeah. I think people ought to watch out for that in themselves. I think it's one of the worst things I think that a person can ever do is to take pleasure in another person's pain.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask, because you when you ended your piece, there wasn't any sort of idea. It's not a scientific piece in the sense. I mean, you make your case and lay it out there. But now that you've had a few years and you've looked back at it, let me ask you: what do you think culturally is a way out of this victim culture? Do you think that it just will play itself out naturally, that we will evolve in 20 or 30 years, that by mid-century, most of the quote-unquote wrongs that have been inflicted will have played themselves out, and it just takes sort of the dinosaurs dying out, and each succeeding generation gets a little less bigoted, a little less hyper, a little less whatever, or do you think there's any kind of shortcut?
I don't know. Let me first say what I first thought. Might be the way out, right? So, to give you my personal take on victim culture or victimhood culture, I think it's bad. And I think that, say, Jonathan Haidt, for example, thinks it's bad as well. And I think Jordan Peterson thinks it's bad. One of the chief things that makes it bad is that it weakens people, particularly the people that it seems to want to help. So, if there is some remedy for people who feel that they have been insulted on, let's say, racial or sexual grounds, if there is some justice that they feel they can get from a university administrator or from a Twitter mob that lobbies their workplace and costs them their job, or if people feel that they need trigger warnings about offensive content that might be in a film or in a lecture or something like that, then it is the, quote, victims who are harmed by this the most, because the way that we strengthen ourselves and learn to overcome these situations is by repeated exposure to the stimulus and to that situation of challenge, to rising to it. The other thing, and I don't know if I mentioned this specifically in my essay, but it was something that I was thinking about even then. And this is the idea of, it's an existentialist idea. So Jean-Paul Sartre, his essay "Existentialism is a Humanism," I read it several years ago, and it really haunted me. It talks about how everybody is essentially responsible for all the choices that they make. And although Sartre doesn't talk about this, I would say that people are responsible for their mental states to a large degree as well. We are responsible, in part, for how we mentally respond to situations where other people, let's say, insult us. And if we appeal to an external authority to solve that problem, then we are deceiving ourselves. We're dodging the responsibility. If we act as though somebody else is to blame for the offense we feel, then we are being dishonest in a sense, and that dishonesty ultimately will harm us. So the thing that you would be tempted to say is, right, we need a revival of these kind of existentialist values, or of a sense of personal responsibility. We need a vigorous push back towards dignity culture. We need everybody to believe sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
But I don't think that is likely to work.
Yeah. Well, let me just give you this. The thing that I think, and putting aside the larger issues of cultural victimhood, just on an individual level, if you and I are buddies and we're out drinking, and one day you tell me, when I was 7 years old, Father Flanagan took me behind the altar and sodomized me or fingered me or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
As a 7-year-old, or 8 or even 10-year-old, you have every right to feel traumatized and victimized. But now, if you're pushing 40, 30 years later, if you're still using that as an excuse, that something that happened 30 years ago by some deviant is the reason that you do not have A, B, or C. You haven't met Miss Wonderful. You don't have the job that you want. You're not doing what you want to do. That's on you.
Yeah.
And if you were to say to me, well, Dan, you're being insensitive, that's you being a victim there. And that's the kind of personal thing that I think has to stop. Everyone has someone who's abused them. Everyone has whether it's emotionally, physically, personally, a bad boss, a pedophile priest, Uncle Jack who took you to the woodshed, whatever. But you have to let those things go. You can't. It's puerile, and it's just a lack of maturity.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to diminish, the effect that, say, being abused as a child could have on somebody. That's not something that I know about firsthand, and I know it's very difficult for some people. But in a general sense, Yeah, you aren't responsible, and you can't be held to account for the things that people did to you, but you can be held to account for the way that you respond to those,
Yeah.
particularly many years later,
Yeah.
right? And as you say, if you use those things for an excuse, well, the joke is on you, as it were. Like, you are your own victim in that case. You know, you are the victim of your own evasion.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I think about in this context, I'll use another example. Let's say, I'll make it very unpleasant, right? Let's say you are a woman and you are very fat, and you would dearly love to find a sexual partner who will commit to you wholeheartedly, and you can't do it. Now, that's not to say it happens to all fat women, but there are fat women who find it difficult to find sexual partners. And one of the responses that a certain kind of feminism has to offer this situation is to say, well, it is society that must change so that this person can find a partner, because this person is a victim of society's artificial views about what is attractive. Now, whether or not those views are artificial or socially constructed or whatever, this person has two options facing them. They can lose weight, which I assume it may not be easy, but it will be possible if they exercise their will.
Yeah.
Maybe in an extreme way, they may have to fast, or they, may have to radically alter their diet. For example, they may have to have surgery. Okay, but these are things that would be within their power. Or they could try to change the entire society and what nearly every man thinks of as attractive, and that this is the way that they are going to try and better their circumstances. Right. Now, as a younger man, I used to take that view that the way that we should approach our problems was by taking collective action. Yeah. And I think that that is a very bad idea to sell to people, because the fact is that if you have a problem and you want your situation to be better, the best thing that you can do, which will give you the best hope of improving your circumstances and solving the problem, is to take individual action personally.
Yeah, and it's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of me saying that I'm owed a spot on my favorite professional basketball team, even though I don't have the stamina, the strength, the skill. But because I'm a good person, I deserve that spot. Or similarly, that I should have a chance to hit the sheets with Jennifer Aniston and Angelina Jolie. Because I don't look like Brad Pitt, I'm never going to get that chance. Well, that's ridiculous, because Angelina Jolie and Jennifer Aniston and all of Brad Pitt's former lovers don't owe me a damn thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I mean, if you could pursue what you thought you were owed forever, and you would never get it.
Right.
There may be some small chance of you getting into Jennifer Aniston's pants if you worked on your Hollywood film career and became a great success. It's still possible if you go down that route, but it isn't possible if you just want to beg for what you think you deserve, or if you want to change the whole society so that you can get what you want.
Well, let me just ask you now. Then let's just wrap this up. And so you gave a sense that you have evolved in this. Where do you now currently sit, and what is your, say, political and or social view about the culture? You feel victim culture is not a good thing, and so what is your just current status quo view of things? And then we'll just talk a little bit about any of the writings that you have coming up, especially in a social vein.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, you did ask what I thought might change things.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the sociological view, and again, I think Campbell and Manning are the names of the people here, and Jonathan Haidt has kind of summarized their paper on this. Take the sociological view, and you say that victimhood culture is the result of social atomization, strong authorities, and relative egalitarianism. Okay, so egalitarianism is not something we would want to do away with. So forget about that. I think you could weaken authorities. I think that if, say, Title IX administrators were forced not to use you know about this thing with Title IX administrators when they are looking at like campus rape or sexual harassment complaints, that some of them have been using I think it's called a preponderance of evidence standard. So if it's more than 50%, then they have to find the person guilty rather than a beyond reasonable doubt standard.
Yeah, they all have that kind of silliness,
yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if they were held to higher standards, or if the powers of their officers were diminished, if there were, for instance, one of the things, I think this is almost pure fantasy, but I would love to see a law that prohibited employers from firing their employees based on things that they said on their social media account.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I live here in the U.S. in what's called a right to work state. A few years ago, my employer was breaking safety and health laws. I followed the company policy to report them internally. They fired me. And in Texas, where I live, it's legal for a company to break the law and then fire the employee that reports them. And that's perfectly legal. And they call it right to work here in the U.S. So, when I see all this stuff I mean, there are so many things that I think are far more weighty and could have far more value. And this is not to diminish the Me Too movement or anything, but it always seems that if we scream the loudest, this is what gets taken place. But especially here in the U.S., workers and not management, but non-management workers are one of the few groups that have gone backwards. The decline of unionism, the decline of living standards for the middle class here in the U.S., and I don't know if it's the same in Australia, has been very sharp. It's one of the few areas where things have gotten worse demonstrably. And yet that's never talked about because it's easy. These kinds of social issues like Me Too or this Islamic, the battle of cultures, these kinds of things are easy to wave around and get a lot of Twitter hits, and people can put out these sort of phony solutions and let's just all get along kind of thing. But these real deeper systemic issues of, for example, billionaires and CEOs becoming billionaires, and the working class getting screwed, they're difficult and they don't get the same kind of airplay.
Yeah, I mean, so taking that sociological view, I think the one policy lever that you would likely have available to you if you were to diminish the power of victimhood culture would be to diminish the power of the institutions that can mete out justice for microaggressions and other slights, for example. But I mean, here are the other things which I think are important, right? I don't know if the effort is misapplied or what, but so another thing is taking control of the universities to an extent. Now, I think Jonathan Haidt and I think Jordan Peterson maybe talks about this a little bit less, but or at least in the retaking kind of thing. The humanities part of the university has been almost totally occupied by the political left, and not just the left, but a very specific part of the left. Let's call it the new left. And I think that one of the reasons that let's say this victimhood culture or identity politics is so rife within, let's say, the media or on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever, is that we now have people in their, let's say, their 30s who are entering positions of cultural and institutional power, who have been thoroughly indoctrinated into these kinds of views in their humanities education. And it's particularly important in the media because media people tend to do humanities education. I think I'm just heading around to that kind of like unions and class issue that I think you're getting at. Something which I think a lot of people in the mainstream culture may not appreciate is that, let's say you were in an angry conversation about this and somebody misadvisedly use the word cultural Marxism. Well, somebody would come back to you and say, like, cultural Marxism is not a thing. What even is that? However, identity politics, as I understand it, from the readings that I did in the history of cultural studies, which now has a big effect on literary studies and stuff as well. Identity politics and the quote new left were contrived to keep left-wing causes going when it seemed that capitalism had solved the issues, right? Like, we had largely, it seemed, solved issues of absolute poverty, a certain degree of unionization, advances in labor rights, and advances in technology, caused the rise of the middle class and people not to be worrying about, dying for lack of food or largely for lack of medical treatment or whatever, right? So we were seen to be over these things. Communism in the Soviet Union was failing, right? So how are we going to keep the political left going? We will do it by shifting the locus of oppression into these marginalized identity groups, and that became the basis of academic disciplines, and it was taught to people, and it's what dominates the cultural discourse today. I certainly think that it was probably a mistake to stop thinking about class so early.
Well, I
yeah,
think,
I'm not sure that's, yeah.
yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, and it is. And I've always said this, and I did a show a couple of shows ago with a black fellow talking about what I call white racial pathology here in the U.S. And it's always, you have this stratification here in the U.S. of what we call the 1%, which is mostly white, mostly rich. And then you have a few still people in the middle class. I'm probably in the lower middle class. And then you have the growing poor. And the growing poor white always seem to want to identify with that 1%. They think they can one day be that way. And you hear these stories about someone invents something and they become a millionaire, or someone has some guy is a great sports athlete and he makes it one. What we call white trash here in the U.S. And they're always better. They're always sort of shown. The Trump kind of person will always say, well, you're still better than a black person or a Latino or an American Indian, and this is enough to satisfy these people so that they will vote against their economic and personal interests. Oh, we're going to vote. We're going to talk about these distraction issues. Gay marriage. We can't bake a cake for gay couples. We're going to talk about abortions because it's so fun to talk about a clump of fetal cells. And then when those cells become an actual person, we're not going to give a damn about them. You have all of these real issues that become these sort of pseudo issues that are waved about that no one really gives a damn about. I mean, I've never met anyone who really, if they understood what abortion was, who'd be against it. I've never really understood anyone who I've talked about homosexuality or gay marriage that, okay, you want to have families, you want people to be together. What does it matter to? What do you lose if two females or two males are bonded in union that they seek to choose freely? And here in the U.S., for example, we have overwhelming support for what's called leftist issues. Most people support gay marriage. Most people support abortion rights. Most people support a plenum of issues. And yet they still keep voting for these Trump idiots. And Hillary was a bad candidate. I didn't vote for her. But this is what we have in the U.S. And I suspect it's similar around the world. I know that. Do you think that there's a lot of these distraction issues? I mean, that's what I got from what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's probably, it's the left is doing it to themselves. You do hear this argument from a range of places that the left's obsession with these issues is making it more difficult to address what's really important, right? Whatever that may be. I mean, I think in the United States, case, although I wouldn't want to like wade right into an issue. I think one of the things that's very different between, say, America and Australia is that in Australia we have universal healthcare, and that makes being poor greatly less terrifying.
Yeah.
Right? You are not going to die of being poor in Australia. Whereas, I mean, people would argue who's really responsible, right? But there's a situation where if you're poor in America and you have a disease, you will die. If you're poor in Australia and you have the same disease, you will survive.
Yeah.
That I think is an issue of real concern to people. Of much greater concern than, whether they serve, tacos on Cinco de Mayo or something like that.
I think people have lost sight of what was called once the commonweal, that we all are part of society. We have duties and responsibilities as well as rights. And people will look at someone like, say, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or these obscenely rich billionaires, and there's this idea that somehow they were self-made, which is a load of shit, because someone gave Bill Gates his first loan and he had white skin. If Bill Gates had been black, he'd probably not be Bill Gates. Jeff Bezos, Amazon couldn't survive without the U.S. Post Office or other postal services that deliver their stuff for them and minimize the cost. All the roads, all the infrastructure of telecommunications are things that any company, the largest ones like Walmart or whatever's the largest company in Australia, could not do by themselves. We're all interdependent, and people don't want to realize that.
I mean, I must say, I'm something of a believer in, the idea of the self-made man and of the contribution that certain businesses make to society. What I will say in relation to that, though, is that it does concern me that many big businesses, and particularly businesses of a certain nature, say ones that are associated with infrastructure or with property development, they do seem to rely to a great extent on government favors. Corporate welfare is one of the words that you could use to describe that. And I'm not a fan of that.
And here in the U.S., we have corporate personhood. I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but a corporation is considered a person. Corporations got personhood 45 years before Black Americans did, actually, in 1819 or 1820. But instead of going through history here, because we're getting a little off topic, let me just ask you then what you what do you now do as a main source of income? Are you a social commentator in Southeast Asia? Do you write mainly for the Australian magazines, or what?
This is an interesting question, right? And the answer is not particularly comfortable for me, I must say.
Okay, well, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'll answer it. It's interesting. It's sort of related to some of the things that we talked about. But so I make most of my income as a freelancer. As I said, I write advertising. I edit books for people. I maintain websites, do all sorts of things like that. I have a Google Ads campaign that finds clients for me, and I get referrals and all that kind of stuff. I have felt kind of in exile from the academy. I realized that I wouldn't call myself left-wing anymore, right? That might be another conversation, but knowing that was the case, I didn't think that it was likely that I would have a career as an academic. And that is one of the reasons why I didn't finish my doctorate. My scholarship ran out. I started working. I ended up considering whether it would be worth my time to try and finish, and I decided that it wouldn't be. I still feel like I want to write about things, and in Southeast Asia, there are things that I want to write about. However, in the country that I live, which I won't mention, although people can probably find that out if they research, It's it is not a democratic country, and the penalties for saying the wrong thing are terrifyingly harsh. And I unfortunately do not feel like I have the courage to put myself and my family at risk by commenting in any way on the political affairs of the place where I live. And that is I find that a very confronting situation, because I had seen myself as somebody who had something to say, as a writer, particularly. And I may channel that into other areas, into fiction, for example. I may write things that are entirely abstract or not about the place where I live. But I think, if I can relate it back to what we've been talking about here, right? I think a lot of people in my home country, and I think a lot of people in America, don't really understand what it's like to genuinely live in a place where you are constantly afraid that speaking your opinion honestly may get you thrown in jail, for example. These places do exist, right? You can go and see what it is like to live in a place where it is illegal to speak your opinion. And essentially, in the place where I live, the thing that you really have to worry about, there is one particular taboo, which I won't mention. And if you fall afoul of this taboo, you are toast. You'll be in jail for 10 years. One of the things that concerns me very greatly about victimhood culture and about, Twitter vigilante mobs, right? The sort of people that will try and dig up something from your past to get you fired, or God knows, I don't know, get you sued or even get you thrown in jail. They create these taboos. They create things that topics that you can't speak about, that it requires incredible courage to speak about. And I just think you shouldn't do it. Like Jordan Peterson, for example. I don't know how much you or other people have talked about him on the show. But, he's very into how important it is to kind of live the truth, right? Speak the truth, live the truth. This is one of the things that stops totalitarianism, for example, or genuine fascism, not, we want to say Trump is a fascist, that kind of pretend fascism, but genuine, like Adolf Hitler fascism or Joseph Stalin totalitarianism. One of the ways that you hold this up is by speaking and living the truth and being fearless and allowing people to speak the truth. Victimhood culture, the way that it is playing out now, it puts that at risk. And I think that is the scariest thing about it.
Okay, well, let's end there, and I want to thank Ben for spending over an hour speaking. BenHourigan.com. I will link to it below this video. Anyone who watches this can contact him there for his books or even for his editing skills. And thank you again, Ben, for speaking with me.
You're welcome. Thank you.